let's talk about the very latest in terms of what we know with regards to this horrific explosion at the hospital. All of the, it's even unclear right now what the death count is, what the casualty number is, but we've seen from the photos there was absolutely horrific carnage here. So we've got some new evidence on kind of both sides of the equation. I'm just going to lay it out and you all can make of it whatever you will. The first piece that I think is really critical here is the actual photos in daylight of what the explosion and the fallout at this hospital was. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. So you can see it looks like whatever happened here did not hit the hospital directly. It was in this courtyard where all of these cars are. And, one of the things that people who thought this was Israeli missile were saying is, listen, this was way too much damage for a Hamas rocket. Mm-hmm. This paints a little bit of a different picture because now there's a theory of, all right, but it could have been Islamic Jihad or Hamas rocket that, misfire and falls into this courtyard and then ignites a fire with the fuel in these cars. So these photos, give some credence to that potential theory. You also have Biden, yesterday we told you that he indicated he thought it was done by, quote, the other team, which I could really do without the casual sports team analogies here when you're talking about human life, but we'll put that aside for a second. At that time, he did not indicate whether that was based on what the Israeli government was telling him or whether that was based on our own intelligence assessments. He later clarified that this was based on our own intel community. Let's take a listen to what he has to say.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. But there's a lot of people out there not sure. So we've got to overcome a lot of things.
How about the hospital, sir? People all over the region are upset about the hospital and don't necessarily believe you or the Israelis that they didn't have anything to do with it. You have a message to the people in the streets right now?
Well, I can understand why in this circumstance they wouldn't believe. I can understand that. But I would not, you notice I don't say things like that unless I have faith in the source from which I've gotten it. Our Defense Department says it's highly unlikely that it was Israelis, but if it had a different footprint and they've intercepted some. Anyway, so that's why, if you notice, I didn't say it first. I wanted to make sure that I knew. And look, and I'm not suggesting that Hamas deliberately did it either. It's that old thing, gotta know how to shoestring. And it's not the first time Hamas has launched something that didn't function very well. So I don't know all the detail, but I do know the people at the Defense Department who I respect, the intelligence community that I respect. It's highly improbable that Israel did that.
So the official statement from a spokeswoman for the National Security Council is, quote, the U.S. government assesses that Israel was not responsible for an explosion that killed hundreds of civilians yesterday at that hospital. Our assessment is based on available reporting, including intelligence missile activity and open source video and images of the incident. I'll just give you a little bit more details of what the intelligence community is anonymously telling the New York Times. They're cautioning this analysis is preliminary. They were continuing to collect and analyze evidence. Neither side's claims about who is responsible have been independently verified still by any news outlet. And this is part of the problem, is that journalists, by and large, are not allowed into Gaza to be able to see for themselves and interview people and try to assess the evidence that exists. That American intelligence includes satellite and other infrared data showing a launch of a rocket or missile from Palestinian fighter positions within Gaza. American intelligence agencies have also analyzed open source video recordings collected by journalists and others of the launch, showing it did not come from the direction of Israeli military positions, according to those officials. Israeli officials have also provided the U.S. with intercepts, we're going to get to that in a minute, of Hamas officials allegedly saying the strike came from forces aligned with Palestinian militant groups. Of course, I don't have to tell you that U.S. intel community and the Israeli intel community have every incentive here to, paint things as in a certain portrait. But that is what they are saying. we do have a little bit of an independent investigation from the BBC of open source information, basically, that is available. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen, this BBC investigation. They took some of the photos of the site, and they were actually able to get one of their journalists into Gaza to also talk to people on the ground and get like eyewitness reports about what they say happened here. But they contacted 20 different think tanks, universities, and companies with weapons expertise. 9 of them did not respond. 5 couldn't say either way. And then there were experts that they spoke to at the remaining 6. They asked whether the available evidence, including the size of the explosion, the sounds heard beforehand, could be used to determine the cause of the hospital blast. So far, they say the findings are inconclusive, but they did have 3 experts who say it is not consistent with what you would expect from a typical Israeli airstrike with a large munition. They were looking at things like the size of the crater.
Yes.
They were looking at, the size of the fire. They were looking at the videos and the flashes that were in the sky. One person says they likely indicate the projectile was a rocket with an engine that overheated and stopped working. So that's what they said. Let me get you in on this, and then I'll tell you the piece on the other side as well.
Yeah, I'll be honest. This is the difficulty of really covering and operating on this. I approached it with extreme skepticism from the beginning. The big issue that has happened here was with Hamas specifically. They have, I'm not even going to say I had any credibility with them, but for them to come out immediately and say that the hospital itself was destroyed and then report a death count, which is clearly now not accurate, that does a tremendous blow for our ability to even trust the most basic casualty information that was coming out of there, which I think most of the international community previously, I'm not saying that they weren't skeptical, but previously they're like, yeah, this like roughly tracks with an independent assessment. So good luck to them now from now on out, because it's not like you can really believe it. Out in terms of the pictures themselves, and based on evidence and testimony that I reviewed from people who are former Human Rights Watch investigators and others who do not have an agenda and previously been highly critical of Israel, they say it's not consistent with the JDAM, which is what the type of munition that the Israelis typically drop on Gaza, and would be more likely to be what the Israelis are claiming is that it's a misfired Palestinian Islamic Jihad group rocket that fell, tragically misfired, and fell onto this parking lot. Because the hospital itself remains standing, the scorch burn marks that are on the top of the vehicles, the smaller crater that is inside of the hospital, and all of that, combined with the images themselves, which just don't appear consistent with what other images of Israeli strikes inside of Gaza, which cause a tremendous amount more damage, not necessarily carnage, because carnage is different, because it could be, and that's just only honestly highlights how packed Gaza is, or all these people are in this freaking parking lot because they thought it was safe. So it's a tragedy and a situation from all of that. The only skepticism I have is that the transparent nature of how, I'm not going to say fabricated, but suspect that much of the evidence that the Israelis put out is difficult for me. And I think that's where some of us have to be honest, where their evidence that they put out actually made me more skeptical. Whereas if I had just looked at this from photos in daylight, I'm like, all right, it wasn't an Israeli strike. And I still actually believe that, based on what I saw. But the stuff that they put out has honestly only poisoned the well more in terms of what they've released. You guys covered it yesterday. Releasing a video with the wrong timestamp, then deleting it. And then, if you want to get into the transcript of the conversation that they put out, where I would almost tell them, I'd be like, guys, you just should sit this out, because a lot of people don't believe you. There are some serious questions about much of the stuff that you've put out there. The best thing you have going for you right now are the actual photos of the damn parking lot.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
well, because part of the reason the parking lot piece and like the size of the crater is so critical. Hamas rockets have literally never caused this much damage. Yeah. And while we don't know the exact death count, there was a significant loss of life here, huge numbers of people who were killed. We've seen the videos of the dead and the wounded. It was obviously a grave catastrophe, whatever the specific death count is. So when you look at that and you're like, there's never been an Islamic Jihad or Hamas rocket, which are these like rinky-dink Frankensteinian cobbled together from like leftover Israeli missiles. They have never caused this much damage. That puts questions in your head. And there's also just like Israel's bombing the hell out of Gaza right now. Their whole like, oh, we would never target hospitals is bullshit. This specific hospital was damaged days earlier. They've hit medical facilities in this specific war, not to mention going back historically. And, with a variety of situations, but specifically we'll talk about Shireen Abu Akleh, like they've been caught basically fabricating evidence in the past. So that's why people were immediately skeptical. You shouldn't believe what Hamas says. You should not believe what the Israelis say either. And let me give you a couple pieces here. So number one, let's put this up on the screen from Kent Roth. This is per Le Monde, but I've seen other outlets also validate this at this point. They report that this hospital had already been damaged by Israeli bombings on October 14th and on October 15th. They had done these they call them like a warning or a knock on the roof. The Israeli army had called the hospital's director to tell him those 2 shots were warnings to evacuate, according to the local health ministry. But again, this has also been independently verified. I saw it in the New York Times this morning, for example, that this specific hospital, they had hit with minor damage twice on October 14th and October 15th, said you have to evacuate. And then, it doesn't seem crazy that then it was actually hit, at least in the courtyard, by something. So that's one piece of evidence on the other side. The other one is, you referenced this. So we already had the video that they put out that they had to delete because it had the wrong timestamps. They got called out immediately. Like, this is not the same strike that, hit this hospital. What are you doing? So they had to delete it. Then they claim to have additional visual evidence and this intercepted conversation between what they are claiming is 2 Hamas militants that has really been called into question for its veracity. Let's take a listen to, this is a British news channel, is Channel 4, talking about this quote-unquote intercepted conversation.
They present what they say is 2 Hamas operatives talking about the attack.
بس بقول لك أول مرة بنشوف الصاروخ زي هيك والشظايا هذه فبقول لك تبع الجهاد الصواريخ الجهاد الإسلامي.
Hamas call this an obvious fabrication. 2 independent Arab journalists told us the same thing because of the language, accent, dialect, syntax and tone, none of which is, they say, credible. Equally, Israel claims the Islamic Jihad failed missile was fired from here, a cemetery very close to the hospital. But look again at the video of the event. The trajectory of the missile doesn't line up with that location. Too high, too horizontal. Confusingly, the Israelis' presentation also says the missile was fired from a location down in the southwest. It can't be both. Islamic Jihad say it was an Israeli missile and they have the warhead to prove it, but they haven't produced it.
So,
well, release the damn warhead.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And again, this would all be, this could be ameliorated if journalists were allowed into Gaza so you could have more independent verification because we're relying on, propaganda on both sides. But if you, I don't speak Arabic. I have no idea what a local Gaza accent sounds like. Right. But there were, I was seeing a lot of people online who were saying, this does not sound like a local Gaza accent. And then you have 2 independent journalists who are saying, no, I'm not buying it from the tone, the way they're talking, the expressions they're using. This doesn't sound like it at all. And just reading the conversation itself is so stilted as to be sort of ridiculous. They're like, yes, it was certainly us. It was definitely not the Israelis. And then the other piece they point out is that they're claiming it came from the cemetery. That doesn't line up with the visual evidence. So there you go.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a munitions expert. I don't speak any Arabic. I can barely order food and a coffee. And that's the extent of what I've got.
I know how to say thank you.
Yeah, there you go. In terms of how it all goes, for me, it has nothing to do with anything that the states have put out.
Yeah.
It is purely based on what you see from there. And again, from munitions and analysts, experts who are attached to organizations here in the West who I believe not have an agenda. That's not the best from my analysis and of theirs. And based on all that, it doesn't seem to me like it was an Israeli strike. So there it is. I just think, though, that, I don't know. I mean, it is difficult. This has become some sort of massive crisis online. I'm curious what you think of it, for all of that. I have sympathy for the people who believe it was the Israelis. I think most people did, to be honest. And I think correctly.
Well, it's the most logical explanation.
It was a a very logical
Yeah.
explanation. At the same time, I think it's a good lesson that we can all move in forward. Like, we cannot really believe a single word that Hamas says. We have to be deeply skeptical from all of them. And everyone's like, oh, like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and all of that. I honestly do think they should delete their tweets at this point. I think because based upon the evidence, or at the very least, they should come forward and should clarify. Their core message was not a bad one, and it's not unacceptable or pro-terrorist. If you go and you read what they were saying, is they're like, look, we want to stop hostilities because we want
They want a
civilians
ceasefire.
to die. And I think, look, I will not live in a world where that is not acceptable discourse in the United States of America. So anyway, that's my take for all of this, for the assessment and all of that. Be skeptical, and you should wait. I'm glad that you guys, I'm actually very thankful that you guys didn't come on the air until the next morning when there were more details and you could offer more. And now, you know, we're 48 hours away so into this. I will say, though, the most annoying take that I've heard on this is they're like, it's the New York Times' fault for reporting what Hamas said, that there were protests in Lebanon. I'm like, yeah, you know, guys in Lebanon are like, hey, let's go storm the U.S. embassy because the New York Times said so.
Right.
Not because their, you know, shithead friend on WhatsApp is like, brother, they have done this based upon what Hamas says. It's like, if you really believe that, you don't know anything about the Middle East or about how these people get even their news.
It's preposterous to imagine that the U.S. media is anti-Israel. There is
that's a whole
zero.
conversation.
I mean, when you look at the language they use about, you know, the humanity they grant, rightfully so, to the Israeli citizens who were killed versus the way Palestinians are treated, and you look at the way they've covered this conflict, there is no doubt which side they tend to favor. So I think the idea that, you know, New York Times or any of these U.S.-based media outlets are anti-Israel anyway is completely absurd. But, you know, the last thing I'll say, just to put all of this in context, is you already have thousands of Palestinians who've been killed. You have over 1,000 Palestinian children who have been killed. You have 1 million Palestinians in Gaza who have been displaced. You have a dire humanitarian situation. Like, whatever happened with this hospital doesn't take away from the fact war is hell, the carnage is horrific, and this is only just the beginning. So
I do
think
agree
that's
with
where
that.
we are.
I will
Yeah.
say, though, that they do a desperate and a disservice to their cause whenever they're caught lying like this. And so
But, like,
it's important to be
you shouldn't-
important to be accurate. You know, if you're going to be
Yeah, but that's true for Israel too. Lie all the time,
Of course,
including here.
I'm not talking about them. I'm talking
Yeah.
about people in the United States who are boosters of their cause. It's like, it just makes you, like, I think Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, they look like fools, you know, for immediately jumping on this, and they haven't deleted it. They haven't even addressed it. I mean, look, you know, you already know when you're in a position of weakness, like, you have to do everything in your power in order to bolster the ground that you stand on, because you know that you're critical. I mean, we know this when on Ukraine, right? Like, the media can lie about Ukraine 10 out of 10 times, and nobody's going to say a damn thing.
Right.
If we say one wrong thing 1 out of 10 times, that's it. The next 9 out of 10, if you get them right, it doesn't matter. I don't think it's fair, but, like, that's just how it goes. And so I think for them, they have a responsibility to the anti-war cause, to the pro-Palestinian cause here, in order to try and be more accurate. And retrenching and behaving like the other side, I mean, that doesn't make you noble or good, you know, based on what I've seen from the two of them so far. That's just I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be reasonable for them to address. Now, there are way more. For me, I'm still 50-50 on what, you know, the evidence actually shows and who was actually responsible. But it was an entirely logical conclusion when Israel's literally dropped, you know, 6,000, 7,000 bombs on Gaza at this point. To see this carnage and say, obviously it was, and especially when you have no track record of any Hamas or Islamic Jihad rocket creating this kind of damage, to come to that conclusion. I think it would be appropriate for them to acknowledge that there is a lot more evidence in the other direction now. I think absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But your point about, you know, of course, they're going to be held to a higher standard. Like, how much of the, like, Israeli propaganda and lies that have been documented over many years goes down, and there's never any question about it. There's never any, like, demands to retract or correct or whatever. But you're right. The expectation should be that they're going to be held to a different standard, because anytime you have a dissident political view, that's just the way it works.
That's how
in
it
American
goes. I mean,
politics.
I'm not saying it's fair, but it's life, and that's just how it goes.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.